All right, so I don't know how many of you actually have worked in this space and understand, sort of what a target product profile is, but we'll go through that today, sort of the evolution, and we'll talk about, real world examples of different healthcare products, why it's important, and it's a real important tool for new product planning and sort of planning what you're doing both in the lab and on the business side of things. And so actually today our objective is not to produce a draft TP. That'll be upcoming for some of the folks in the Nanomedicines Innovation Network sphere. I think there's about 6 companies that are going to be doing that. But I'll go through the history of a TPP, what it is, why it's useful, the adoption of as a tool in different spheres, pharmaceuticals, medtech, biotech, as well as patient advocacy groups and the UN as well. How they're put together, some examples, and then hands-on, we'll talk about really how to find information for your TPP. And then for the companies that we'll be working with, we can go through together in the future what that actually looks like. So, what is the vision, why, and the value proposition of what you're doing? The specific value you create, the value you're creating for your specific customers. Most of the time it's patients and physicians, but you also need to think about beneficiaries such as payers and other stakeholders. And so the target product profile is it's a market definition sort of future. It's not a stagnant document. If any of you have looked at a label from your drugs that you buy either over the counter or from the pharmacy, they typically have like a long label included with them. And sort of this is a mock thing that's been put together in the past to help define the patient population and provide a roadmap sort of the future and all fronts of your product development. So the history, this was originally set up by the FDA. It took 10 years from a clinical development working group to put together an FDA guidance for industry. And when I actually started at Lilly, I'm not going to say exactly when, but it was before 2007. It was one of the key things that I was sort of forced to learn and really appreciated in terms of where it fits. Both on the internal development side as well as external business development side. It's been widely adopted by the industry as well as investors. They always like to ask you what your TPP looks like. And then groups such as patient advocacy groups, non-governmental organizations have put together target product profiles for various diseases to help facilitate the development of drugs and diagnostics in their field. And so, what really happens, this is a great definition from the World Health Organization. It's the desired characteristics of a product in the future, particular disease. To be fair, I like to add sort of secondary disorders if you're looking at a mechanism of action that would fit both of those. It includes safety and efficacy. It really helps inform product developers as well as regulatory agencies. Procurement as well in terms of, for a country that's going to be buying a product, does it fit that TPP? Also funders, R&D and public health authorities, as well as investors and venture capitalists. What's really been pretty cool to see is what WHO has put together these TPPs for sort of what they say missing health products and sort of focusing on unmet needs. And I think it's really an important tool. And it's something that is continuously updated for various disorders. And there's, I think the last number that I saw, there's about 10,000 diseases. And so it's important to have, for unmet need, underserved populations, these type of templates to help drug developers in the future. So the key elements in healthcare product development, the target product profile, one of the key things is unmet need. Looking at a patient population, how is that defined? How is efficacy defined? Is it, for example, in oncology, is it overall survival? Is it progression-free survival? Is it overall response rate? other indications, such as, your cholesterol, there's a number that you look at, and so you've got sort of a very definitive number that you can use to determine whether or not something's efficacious or not. Therapeutic potential, what's the ability to create new treatment? How are you defining that? How does your technology actually benefit the patients? And how does it either improve on standard of care, or does it work for, an absolutely new patient population? And as new techniques such as the single cell sequencing, RNA-seq, it's really allowing us to understand the deep biology of different indications and diseases, and allow for repurposing. There's companies out there that repurpose older drugs to that target a specific particular driver mutation, and they're
being whisked into the clinic very quickly, and hopefully improve the lives of many patients around the world. And the therapeutic potential is super important, but also the reimbursement. How are different organizations such as Health Canada, NICE in the UK, and then the sort of private payers in the States, how do they assess value is super important in terms of the cost. Some of them are actually looking a lot more for real world evidence. There's a number of different groups. So there's BioMarin has an agreement with the UK for one of their drugs, where if the drug doesn't work, they refund the money back to the payers. And I think increasingly real world experience is going to be much more important as time goes on. And so the TPP is really to define what will be required in the future marketplace. So essentially at the point where your product is going to launch. So for many of us working in the early stage space, it's sort of a window to the future, minimum 7 to 10 years down the road. And it's sort of a summary view on the different product parameters based on in-depth analysis of current treatments and what's in the pipeline. And as it evolves, you can incorporate the needs for different stakeholders, including the physicians, patients and payers, and also other groups such as nurses, et cetera. So within biotech and pharma, they're updated periodically in order to adapt to the what's happening internally with your programs, and also external events, namely competitive landscapes. And it's super valuable for the indication prioritization. So many of you have platform technologies, and you're looking at indication prioritization. I know at least of a few within my network that are on nanomedicines, that they've got delivery platform or specific tissues, and there's a multitude of different indications that they can look at. But TPP and other tools are really going to be helpful for them to prioritize the different indications and sort of what's going to be tenable and tractable as they move those programs forward. As I mentioned, it's a key communication tool, both for the internal and external audiences. So in a small company, and I'll get into this a little bit later, it's typically, you're using this for investors, you're using this for potential partners, patient advocacy groups, but you're also, thinking about internally, what does that look like? What does your product have to do in the preclinical setting to sort of translate into the clinical setting? And then it's also very important for you as you need to develop sales forecasts. So if your product is going to be first in class, best in class, what does that look like for that indication? Or if it's an improvement over a known compound, then there's going to be a different sort of TPP. And when you're looking at a number of different programs, these are very useful in terms of prioritizing internal resources. So in terms of a big pharma company, they've got hundreds of different projects, but they have different target product profiles for each major indication that they look at, and then also sort of secondary indications, and resources will be dedicated or taken away from programs based on whether or not they fit the target product profile. So the successful product that meets TPP requirements, assuming that you've done a good job of making
comprehensive target product profile. So you can get regulatory approval in various countries, reimbursement approval, physicians and providers actually prescribe and use the product. And last but not least, patients actually accept treatment and are able to afford it. So the key elements of a target product profile, sort of the description, what the product is. And so in your case, the folks on this call would be, we're a nanomedicine that uses X to target disease. What's the priority indication? What are the secondary indications? Many of you, or some of you at least on this call, I hope have been part of, the COVID vaccine. So we'll go into that in terms of what a TPP looks like for those. And what sort of the base case is, what is the minimal required to get your product onto the market, and then how is it differentiated? How is it what are things that you can do to make your product more valuable to different patient populations? What studies can make it more accepted by payers, can get you a higher percentage of the market? And so, oftentimes we'll put together these TPPs, and your priority indication will be one thing. So let's say you're looking at a particular cancer, but then, there's the data sets that it may be of interest in the secondary indication. And I can tell you many times that I've seen products where the product is now being used in the secondary or tertiary indications, based on, the thought was that it may work, and it turns out working a lot better than the standard of care. Those are things always to keep in mind. And so efficacy, as I mentioned, minimal viable efficacy, subsets of patients is becoming more and more important. I think most of us are recognizing that various diseases have different subsets, and we're learning more and more about the biology of different subsets. The focus is to really identify who would best benefit from the treatment that you're developing, and what would actually be clinically significant. There's a number of drugs that have been approved, but their performance in the real world setting, I wouldn't say is clinically significant, and the prescribing is a bit low, and they're not meeting their sales targets, et cetera. It's important to have that, at your top of mind before you spend, anywhere from $250 million to $1 billion to develop a drug. And then safety contraindications, that's another area of potential differentiation. At minimum, your adverse events should be similar to approved products. But I know that many of you are working on one of the interesting things about nanomedicines, that they are potentially better tolerated. And there's a number of examples, such as Abraxane, other compounds that have been improved through better formulations in nanomedicines. And by decreasing adverse events, you're going to get better uptake and less patients that are dropping off treatment. In terms of dosing and formulation, that's something that's also a differentiation. So many of the earlier approvals in nanomedicines have better PK, for example. So the pharmacokinetics work better in the patients, and so the dosing is better, or they have better efficacy because there's more, for example, chemotherapy accumulating in the tumor and having a better effect. In general, an oral pill is better than an injection versus IV versus continuous infusion. I can tell you, when I was at Eli Lilly, we were working on antisense, and there was folks that were sort of testing a continuous pump for antisense oligonucleotides, and it was quite challenging in terms of the patients having to take having these continuous infusions over a month. Dosing is definitely a differentiating feature, and I know that many of you are working specifically on that as an opportunity, both whether it's dosing to improve PK or dosing to the lung, topical dosing to different tissues. And there's a number of different companies, and we've pulled a lot of their slide decks where different groups are looking at different ways to target specific tissues with nanomedicines. And then the regulatory side of things. So what does approval look like? Is there an opportunity for accelerated approval? including breakthrough therapy designation, orphan designation, and pediatric designation is another thing that's been very successfully utilized by small biotechs. If you, and it's an FDA US program, and if you get approval through the pediatric designation, you can sell a voucher to companies for literally hundreds of millions of dollars in order to pay for your own pipeline, pay for expenses, et cetera, because it allows whoever you sell it to get their drug evaluated quicker, so 6 months earlier. And so reimbursement is very important, and it's important to understand sort of where you can find the information that's going to be needed by payers. You can plan your clinical trials accordingly, understand the metrics, but your ultimate goal is to be preferred status by payers, whether it's in universal healthcare countries such as Canada, UK, et cetera, or on formulary for Medicare, Medicaid in the States, and then as well as private payers. And so this is a patient advocacy TPP that was put together for HIV, which is pretty interesting. And a lot of it is dosing administration. And so this was put together, I think, by the UN, or no, it's actually a group of key opinion leaders that are looking at HIV therapies. So 2020, you've got, the current treatment is oral ART. Future options will be long-acting, neutralizing antibodies, and then down the road, first generation cure. I think we've seen some patients cured, and so I think that's actually a realistic hope in the future. But the ultimate goal is to have a single shot and a patient's actually cured, and they talk about what the efficacy looks like. So it's a viral load below the 20%. Safety and tolerability, super important. In grade 3, let me move this so I can actually see. There we go. So grade 3 events are pretty, they're bad, but grade 4 is quite challenging. A lot of patients will drop off if they have grade 4 events. The dosing, as I mentioned, oral is preferred, but IV would work for a single shot cure. Monitoring, if you have monitoring, it's more challenging. But if you don't need any monitoring, that's fantastic. Storage, room temp is super important for groups that are outside where they don't have cold chain storage. And I think we saw a lot of that with the storage of COVID vaccines. And then financing, the point is that national governments can afford to pay for these treatments, and so the price tag would be a bit lower than you would typically see in a sort of a US type therapeutic. So as I mentioned, there's a lot of examples where you've got drugs that have been approved, but their efficacy isn't enough to really have a clinically meaningful difference. And so, for example, the FDA approved Aduhelm from Eisai and Biogen, but Medicare seek to limited coverage, and it's currently only available through clinical trials. And it's a really difficult situation because the patients are dying to have treatments for Alzheimer's, and certainly Biogen and Eisai would benefit significantly as the drug is sold, but the level of efficacy is not sufficient to make a huge difference in most of the patients that are taking it. And so, another thing to think about as, as nanomedicines can target specific gene mutations, this is a really good example in terms of better understanding of causative biology, allowing for different types of patients to have unique treatments which actually really help. And so, earlier when I first started, lung cancer was either small cell lung cancer or non-small lung cancer. And now you've got, 10 different subtypes, and there's different therapeutics for each of them. And the overall survival rate for lung cancer has changed significantly. And so, lung cancer, breast cancer are sort of the first waves of the subsets, but, we're looking at different other subtypes. In the case of Mesintel Therapeutics, my company, we're looking at subtypes of sarcomas. And, we hope that by having a deep understanding of the biology, we'll provide better treatments. And so adverse events and tolerability also impact significantly market acceptance. And so when I worked at Eli Lilly, one of the things that we put together was a target product profile for the business development team for antipsychotics. And you look at efficacy such as positive symptoms, which would be, patient anger, et cetera, the mania that happens. And then there's also negative symptoms. So negative symptoms are sort of anhedonia, withdrawal, et cetera. A big issue with the drugs that were on the market at the time, so the atypical antipsychotics, was significant weight gain. And hopefully nobody from Lilly's on this call, but back when I was there was a big sort of denial that olanzapine actually caused weight gain, but it does. It caused like significant weight gain for many patients where they're gaining like 50 to 100 pounds. And very significant side effects to that weight gain. And I will tell you that it was internally, there was challenges from the marketing team compared to what we were looking at from an external standpoint in regards to the safety and the weight gain. So that became quite a challenge. And we did see transactions in the space for compounds such as aripiprazole, which did have better weight gain, not as great in terms of the efficacy, but definitely better on the safety. And so some of those patients moved on to those drugs such as Abilify. And I have an example that I found the other day about how to, a company and how they prioritize their business development efforts based on a target product profile. And many of you, some of you may have been involved, products that have been enabled by formulation. I remember when we first heard about COVID, I don't think anybody thought that the nanomedicine and the mRNA vaccines would be the first approved and the most efficacious in the space. And as we've all seen, it really, I guess it's not an understatement that basically saved a lot of the patients around the world. And products such as, also important to the patients that receive them, Jazz Pharmaceuticals acquired Celator for a unique combination of drugs within their formulation. And I think most of us would agree that we're at the beginning of nanomedicine, and there's a lot more opportunities for these type of therapies for patients around the world. So this is a cool TPP that Ali Ardikani and the Novature folks put together for Novature Ventures, and really showed sort of what they looked at in terms of the safety, the efficacy, logistics, and the cost of goods, et cetera. And so they put together a total score. But as we've seen, really I guess it's retrospect, but the RNA vaccines are the standard of care, and the inactivated viruses weren't really, their efficacy was pretty suspect, unfortunately. So, they have a lot of great parameters, but overall, in terms of sales, it's been the RNA vaccines. And I really like how Ali and his team put this together. And this is something that, we actually use in terms of a scorecard for the internal programs that we're looking at. All right, so the future of nanomedicine, and I know that you guys have a seminar coming up in terms of what's next generation LNP technology, and the TPPs are going to be super important. Increase the efficiency of LNPs. What's coming next? We're at 2023 now. From what I know and what I've seen from some of you is that specific tissue integration, using gene therapies, et cetera. So it's a pretty exciting time for what you're doing. There's definitely, I agree, vast untapped potential. And this is from Dr. Shanaz Suleiman from Recode, and they are looking at LNPs that target specific tissues. So, when you're constructing a TPP in a startup or in your academic lab, it's typically a few people. It's your founders, your technical, scientific, and engineering if you're in a medical device group. Key thing is to, once you have a decent sense of what you think makes sense, run this by advisors, whether they're clinical or business, different consultants, your board, friends in the space, and support personnel. And I'll certainly put in a plug for Entrepreneurship UBC for my teams. You look at there's a real in-depth look at the literature. We basically have a list of companies that we look at for any indication that we're interested in. I follow them on Twitter, I follow them on LinkedIn, and I look for their investor presentations. I look for their filings that are publicly available, so their regulatory filings as well as their commercial guide filings, SEC filings, et cetera. Regulatory guidance is super important in terms of what needs to happen. And so there's different things such as the FDA guidance for industry that'll tell you what you need to demonstrate, both on the preclinical and clinical side of things. Labels from approved products. I will also say that it's important to look at the approval documents for approved products, consensus treatment and utilization documents. So real world example evidence, et cetera. And there's different groups that do product evaluations. So in Canada, it's CADTH. In the UK, it's NICE, and there's technology evaluation groups in the US. I think I mentioned investor presentations, conference presentations, and patient advocacy groups have a lot of information in terms of, especially for the rare disorders. And you can find out a lot, and it's really great to bring all this together and to put it into your TPP. So many of you are working on different diseases where there's a lot of different modalities, and I think that's really important to think about. You don't need to be, you need to focus on more than just your nanomedicine. In this case, you've got biologics, you've got small molecules, you've got gene therapy. And I know it's quite challenging, but you really need to think about sort of where you fit in all those parameters. And that's why I really liked the paper that the Novatur Ali Ardakani put together for the COVID vaccines. And when I'm putting together a competitive landscape, it typically looks somewhat similar to this. And we think about what actually would benefit the patient. What's the current standard of care? Are they used to taking pills for this indication? If that's the case, then the efficacy would need to be really a big change if they're going to go to an IV infusion, that type of thing. So it really helps to sort of helps you with your discussions, both your internal team and externally. And so I found this in preparation for this presentation, and it's from a company called Insight, which is a small molecule-based company, and they had sort of a case study on how they use the target product profile to look for prostate cancer opportunities. So, what is business development? In this case, they're looking to bring in compounds. So they acquired different, Ariad, et cetera. They acquired the right to develop Jakafi. They've got an antibody. And so, I would say Insight's one of the bigger biotechs, and they've got some money from one of their lead products. And they've decided from a strategic standpoint that they're going to focus on prostate cancer. So if you don't know much about prostate cancer, it's, half the men over 60 will have prostate cancer at one point in their life. The prevalence is quite big, but it's really important to understand sort of the subsets within prostate cancer. So they did a competitive landscape, looked at the sales, mode of action, and these type of exercises typically, in a big company, you typically get like a few weeks as an analyst to put these together, and and you have access to different reports that can help. But then you'll also have access to internal experts as well as external key opinion leaders, because you can afford to pay them the $500 or $750 that it takes to pay for them to have a phone call. We look at the line of treatment. So a lot of this work is done sort of on the secondary analysis side. So this is from IQVIA or another group like that, where you understand sort of
what each patient is getting and sort of what's first line, second line, third line. You talk to physicians about what that looks like and why. And it could also be reimbursement or efficacy, or some patients just can't tolerate different therapies, so they'll get something else. And then, you look at the size of the opportunity, what class they're getting, and sort of think about, overall, what the market looks like. I've done, I would say, at least 50 of these type of diagrams for different indications back in the day. So I quite enjoy it. I think it's fun, but it's definitely, it's worth the investment that you put into it. And so their conclusions was, essentially they didn't show what the TPP was, but they talk about the importance of understanding the treatment landscape and where it fits. And when we are shopping for our product, we make sure that we have all of this in our back pockets when we're speaking to folks. And with that, I am happy to take any questions. For those of you who I believe are signing up through the Nanomedicines Innovation Network, I look forward to working with you on your target product profiles. And in the deck that we send you, we'll give you an example and a template.
So it was very interesting. Early on, you had a slide called Elements of the TPP, and it was a table. And in it, it said adverse events similar to other approved products under safety, which seems like a bit of an oxymoron. But later in your slides, you had a concept of survival advantage. So how does that play out? I mean, when you've got a startup company, you've got a new therapeutic that you're developing, perfect safety is not necessarily a requirement. It could be modified by, the same adverse events that other approved drugs have, so that makes it acceptable, or that's a plus. Or people live longer, so that quality of life years kind of concept comes into play, and it might have adverse side effects, but you live longer, so that would get you through that particular gate. How does that all play out?
Yeah, I think it's sort of a sliding scale. So, for example, there's a lot of, I know quite a few people who had, not quite a few, but at least a handful of people who had cancers when they were younger. The treatments that they receive, such as chemotherapy, can have really long lasting side effects. So I know people in their 30s and 40s now that are really sort of seeing the side effects. And so there's a real opportunity to, decrease the side effects in those patient populations. But, to be fair, like the more severe your disease is, the more likely that you'll be willing to tolerate a side effect. And so for cancers, for example, some of the side effects are awful. The treatment is worse than the cure is a common phrase that's used. And unfortunately, that's somewhat true in a lot of cases. Some of even the newer therapies, such as immunotherapies, have very significant side effects sometimes. And there are classes of therapies which were not used just because of that. So I always see it as a sliding scale. So
some adverse impacts are acceptable then. You can get a drug approved if it has the adverse side effects. Okay.
Yeah, if it's something for like if it's like a less severe disease, then the tolerance for side effects is going to be less.
That's perfect. Okay, Marshall, do we have other questions?
We do not yet have any other questions.
I see something in the chat here, and that was between you and Ellen. Okay. So I have another question for you, Jonathan. In terms of presenting the results of the TPP analysis, do you have a recommendation to present it in different ways to different audiences? Because I did notice that your colleague Ali at Novator Ventures had one model with, kind of building blocks and kind of ratios, sort of visuals, right, while the HIV one seemed to be in a table format. So is there a best practice for different audiences or different purposes in terms of presenting what you've found?
So the Ali Ardakani Novatur one, they did like a sort of a balanced scorecard.
I think it's cool to do it that way. But to be fair, like all of those assumptions are their assumptions, and it's based on a group that's put that together. So it depends. In that case, it's new science, and so that's the way that they see it, and their model sort of reflects the real world opportunity. In different companies, they have different standards, right? So Eli Lilly, when I worked there, they had a very specific template that they had, and you had to do it the same way for each of them because that's the way management wanted it. But externally, it really, as long as the key elements are there, you can sort of fight through it. And I think what's more important is what your assumptions are on the TPP, and then on the background, have background slides of this is why we think that. And then people will challenge you, and then you can change it, or ultimately somebody's in charge of the whole thing and they will decide.
Yeah. If you see another question, go ahead.
Yeah, Shane, how are you? How public do we make this document? That is an excellent question, and it really, so you can have different versions. You can have a high level of where you fit, but when you go into your mechanism of action, et cetera, sometimes that's confidential. And so, happy to work with you in regards to what that would look like. So, so let's say you're developing a drug for esophageal cancer. You can say, we've developed an antibody to a specific target. That's for the external, and then you'll have sort of the efficacy and the safety, et cetera, sort of high level. But internally, you'll describe the mechanism and why it makes sense. And then in terms of like a data room where people would see it under confidentiality, you can show them more. And sometimes you may not even give them a target, but it's staged for sure. But that's an excellent question.
I think there's another question there's a couple of questions now in the chat. Marshall, would you like to read the first one that's there, the pros and cons question?
Yep, sure.
Yes.
Here it goes. Pros and cons of developing a single TPP for primary and secondary disease indications, or separate TPP for specific disease indications. So which is the better option?
Excellent question. I can tell you what I do, but it's really up to you. So any indication where I see us committing resources, then I'll at least have a placeholder for a separate. But if it's something that's sort of, this mechanism is in the literature and it's potentially, could work in X cancer or X, another inflammatory disease, et cetera, I'll just list it, and then I'll list the references. And, from there, if you decide to work on it down the road, you can go back to it and create a separate one. But because people will always want to know sort of, let's say you've got a mechanism of action that could be sort of a pipeline in a molecule. They like to see the different things. But when you actually have data and ready to commit to it is when I do a separate one. I've seen groups do separate for all. It seems like a bit of like a make work project, but that's what I do. Ellen, yeah, readily available TPP templates. Yeah, well, there's going to be one in the deck that we send out. Feel free to modify, et cetera. I use a different one, but any recommendations for market evaluations other than very expensive commercial reports for those at startup stage? Excellent question, Ellen. And so I'd say many of us are in the same boat in that we don't have access to all those expensive reports. And so what I do is look at all of the companies in the space that are creating drugs towards that indication. And if they're public companies, you can find information on their investor portion of their website. So they'll do presentations. They have R&D days sometimes. And if it's an indication where a big pharma is interested, typically they'll have research and development days. And you can get a ton of free information. There's companies such as Celgene, which had very in-depth presentations on, I think it's multiple myeloma is one of my favorites. It's like one of the better slide decks that I've seen. Smaller companies like that will spend thousands of dollars and then put that information out to try to get investors more interested in their company and what they're doing. If you want to send me a note, Ellen, I'm happy to sort of give you what I would do. But that's one thing. And then if a company has just gone public, they have to file a document called an S1. I look at that, and it will give extensive information about their markets. And R&D days are super important. So I look at R&D days for all the big pharmas every year as much as I can. Excuse me.
That's really, really helpful, Jonathan. Thank you. Any other questions, Marshall?
I don't see any others at present.
So, Jonathan, one of the things that I found fascinating, and I didn't realize that this was the case, that patient organizations and even groups like the WHO undertake a TPP exercise to identify gaps in therapeutic solutions to various diseases, orphan diseases, or underserved disease areas. So, first of all, does that ever reverse engineer for the benefit of a startup company? So if you were a nanomedicines gene therapy company and a rare disease patient organization did a TPP and brought it to you, are there any examples where startup companies start to run with this as a developmental opportunity?
I don't have any examples of startup companies that are doing that, but I think it really helps in some of the diseases, like the UN ones that I found. There's also a hemophilia one. I think it helps stimulate research and helps prioritize which research gets funded. And there's companies called like Helix in the UK, which looks at, computational biology for rare disease. They will always look for a TPP that's out there. So I think it does stimulate research and development, but it also, like if an organization puts together a TPP, they can get different groups like the Gates Foundation to fund research based on that.
Ah, okay, right. So that was really interesting. I hadn't heard that before. The other question, are there any other new questions, Marshall? Oh, here. Yeah,
yes,
there we go. Go ahead.
All right. It's from Ellen Wasson again, who asks, how would you include quality of life indicators in the value of a product in the TPP? For example, better route of administration or fewer doses per day or fewer side effects?
Another excellent question. So quality of life is measured differently depending on the indication. And so I think it sort of behooves you to look at how health-related quality of life is measured in each type of indication, whether it's some indications, it's like how far you can walk, or your lifestyle, etc. Route of administration, fewer doses per day or fewer side effects are always helpful, but it's more important for different indications. So for example, there are diseases such as, I forget the name of it, but there's like rare neurological disorders where there may be a component in the brain. And if you can't treat the brain side effects, you don't get treatment. And so that's a super important quality of life or efficacy and quality of life, because you won't get the drug unless you meet those criteria. But it really, again, depends on, fewer doses per day. So another example would be prostate cancer. The drugs that are given to patients are typically last up to 6 months. And so those dominate the market because the patients don't have to go in and get a painful injection every month. It also saves money on the healthcare side. So understanding, you really need to understand sort of the full package of the benefits, the health-related quality of life, the impact on the physicians, the healthcare networks, et cetera. So it's you're never going to get it 100% right, but I think it helps you to do a deep dive in terms of how everything's measured within that indication. But another excellent question. Thank you.
Marshall, any additional questions?
None visible at present.
So, Jonathan, since we have still got some time left, which is terrific to pick your brain, would it be possible for you or Marshall to pull up that slide that you showed that looked like a spaceship? It was a circular slide, and it was illustrating the landscape, competitive landscape analysis. Now, that it seems like the competitive landscape analysis is a project embedded in the TPP project analysis. Is that true? And if so, could you, it wasn't really clear what all the different slices of that particular pie represented. So could you walk us through that in a little bit more detail about how that's done, how important that is to do, and when do you do that in relation to the TPP? Is it part of it? You do it before or at the end?
Good question. So I would say in terms of how it's done, there's different ways you can do it. In this case, you're looking at clinical assets. So you can look at clinicaltrials.gov and look at your indication and see what's in development. It's kind of painful. The better way is to, I mean, the easier way is to get a comprehensive market report if you can find it. You can also get competitive landscape information from various competitors in this, like early companies in the space might have this data and present it. But you know, for many diseases, I typically look at clinicaltrials.gov and I save a list and then look at, you know, what the modality is, et cetera. I put it all into a spreadsheet and then I'll make a bubble, like a spaceship like this down the road. This is embarrassing, but like when I first started, the competitive landscapes didn't look like this. They were sort of like boxes and tables. But now everybody likes this sort of format. And so, you know, this one right here probably took an analyst about at least a week of full time looking at it. Mm-hmm. And I do it at the same time as the TPP. I don't think you can do a proper TPP without having your competitive landscape done.
Mm-hmm. And are the different slices diseases on the outside and then the type of drug, or is it a drug name? I mean, it's kind of hard to see.
Yeah, so this one is actually companies and then their stage of development and then the modality.
Okay.
This is this probably would cost you $20,000 for somebody to do this.
So you can do it you can do it at home, but it looks more like a table than a
right.
Yeah.
Right.
A visualization in this way. Okay, excellent. So it looks like we might have another question, Marshall.
We do.
Oh, I like this question.
Oh, good. I'll read it out so everyone knows what it is. Question is, in your opinion, who should own the TPP in a small company?
Excellent question. Ultimately comes to, I don't know how small the company is, but typically it's owned by if it's an internal program, it's owned by the therapeutic area. It could be though a business development group that owns it. So so when I was at QLT and I saw Ron Bach on this call, another one of my former colleagues, we had TPPs for, you know, the management told us to look for assets in a specific area. And then we put together target product profiles based on, say, for example, glaucoma. And we had those, and I would say we own them, but we had input from various groups. And so, yeah, it's, I'm sorry, there's not a definite answer, but it really sort of depends. Internal programs are typically by the medical group or new product planning group, if there is a group, or who's ever developing the science. But it's either, if you're a small company and BD is using your TPP, then it can be both. For my company, there's 3 of us, so I guess we all own it. We all have input into it, and I think the key thing is making sure that you have feedback from external key opinion leaders, folks in the field. But excellent question.
Thank you. Marshall, any other questions?
No other questions at present.
So Jonathan, at one point in your talk, you said indications change over time due to better understanding of causative biology. So in terms of the TPP and the landscape assessment, how frequently do you recommend that companies update this? Is this something you should do annually, or what's the schedule for keeping this relevant and current?
Yeah, it really depends on the indication that you're in. It's up. So in a big pharma company, they're looking at 20 different indications. In a smaller company, you're probably looking at one, and you should be updating your competitive landscape monthly. I mean, you should be looking at your competitors. You should have a list, and that should be part of your competitive intelligence plan. For me, so looking at soft tissue sarcomas, I would say I look at all of the companies that I know are developing clinical studies every quarter at minimum, just to see if there's anything that I'm missing. And then any sort of major event, so around different conferences, I'll certainly take a look and update accordingly.
Well, that's really helpful. So it's something you should be bolting on to your operational plans on a monthly or at least quarterly basis. So that's very helpful to know. Any other questions?
No other.
Okay, so Jonathan, we have a couple minutes left. Ron Bach has said, excellent presentation, John, on TPP importance for the development of new medicines. Thanks for that. Ron, glad to have you with us today. Jonathan, what is it we haven't asked you that is very important, a learning you've had along the way in relation to TPP, in relation to doing it well, presenting it well, or even, it's come to my mind, it's a very important asset for a startup company to have. How do you protect it from other people getting access to parts of it you don't want them to? So any sort of lessons learned or any tips before we let you go today?
I would say the biggest thing that I've learned is that you have to defend it. You have to know what went into it and understand your assumptions and be able to defend it accordingly, because there will be people who don't have near as much experience or scientific knowledge as you do that will question it based on their own specific biases. So, I think it's fair to question things based on, the science and the clinical side of things. But in terms of like, oh, that makes no sense, like, you need to have your backup, and you need to be able to defend what you're doing and have the sources, et cetera, available. And you're always selling these things. So super important.
Well, thank you for those concluding comments. And thank you for delivering such a timely and informative presentation to the admin community today.